Okay. All right. We're good.
All right, thank you everybody for coming to our digital culture speaker series. The guest we have today is one of our own faculty, Kristy H.A. Kang, who is jointly appointed between the School of Arts and Engineering and the Design School, and also affiliated with the Media and Immersive Experience Center in Mesa. So we're really fortunate to have Kristy here with us. Kristy brings a very long career working in placemaking, immersive media, storytelling, film, and has been at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore before she came here, which is a powerhouse in these areas. Prior to that, Kristy got a PhD from the University of Southern California from the School of Cinematic Arts, which is also a top-notch program. So always have been in top-notch programs, and hopefully that this time of us also being a top-notch program. Thank you, Kristy. Kristy's work has been very well recognized, and she's had her work shown at many prestigious venues, including the Gwangju Design Biennial in South Korea, the Center for Contemporary Art Singapore, the Getty Research Institute, Los Angeles, and the Jewish Museum Berlin, and also has received the Jury Award for New Forms at the Sundance Online Festival, which is fantastic. Without further ado, I'd like to give it over to Kristy, who will talk to us about the city and maritime space. Thank you, Kristy.
Thank you. Thanks, Pavan, for the wonderful introduction. I'm really actually very happy to be here. I know many of you are online, but this has become, it's a way to introduce myself as a new faculty to the AME community. So I'm really happy to do that today with you. So thank you for taking the time and joining me today. So today I'll be looking at what happens when looking at a city through its representation in digital space. Let me just kind of get okay. By discussing an online research project entitled City Stories, Mapping the Spatial Narratives of Singapore's Landscapes. But first, I thought I'd introduce a little bit of my own background in terms of how I developed an interest in visualizing narratives of the city. Many of my projects act as digital archives and platforms for community storytelling that enrich our understanding of the city and the often intangible narratives that create a sense of. My work essentially asks, how do cities tell their stories? So as a practice-based researcher, my work is situated in digital placemaking, which I've come as an interdisciplinary design practice that experiments with new and emerging media to explore and envision our sense of place. Email? This one. Is it? Is there email? I think it's Zoom. Yeah, I think it's maybe the beeping is maybe people on Zoom coming into the room, perhaps. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I describe my work situated in digital placemaking, which I define as an interdisciplinary design practice that experiments with new and emerging media to explore and envision our sense of place. So just a little background, I began this journey as a member of the Labyrinth Project, which was a pioneering research initiative at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, working at the intersection between theory and practice since 1997. It was founded by media theorist Marcia Kinder, who's now since retired, emeritus professor, and the collective included myself and other media artists, Rosemary Camilla and Scott Mahoy. Through these collaborative works, I developed an expertise in thinking visually and conceptually about digital scholarship, combining cultural history and design practices. So this was really kind of foundation into what we call nowadays, right, digital humanities or practices in digital humanities. So we've been working in this vein since the late 90s on a variety of projects. So one of the projects was The Dawn at My Back, which explored the history of race in Houston, Texas, experienced through a personal memoir by the late filmmaker Carol Parrott Blue. She and I co-directed this project, which won a Sundance Award in 2004 and was included in the UCLA Film and Television Archive film series, LA Rebellion, Creating a New Black Cinema in 2013. The conceptual metaphor for the interface design of this project was the quilt, where each patch from Carol's great-grandmother's quilt becomes a portal to animated landscapes and stories from her memoir. So in this case, Dawn at My Back combined the memoir with the genre of works at Labyrinth, which I began to call spatial narratives. These were projects that explored the city through layers of time. This idea of spatial narratives is exemplified in another project I co-directed called Tracing the Decay of Fiction, Encounters with a Film by Pat O'Neill. Based on Pat O'Neill's 35mm film, The Decay of Fiction from 2002, this project was an interactive archaeological exploration of the Hotel Ambassador. Erected in 1920, the hotel played a crucial role in the development of Los Angeles and was well known for its glamorous Coconut Grove nightclub, where Hollywood stars and moguls mingled with foreign dignitaries and downtown power brokers, and the first Oscars was actually held here. The hotel was also the site of the 1968 assassination of Robert Kennedy, and is now situated in Los Angeles in Koreatown and a K-12 school. So it's been converted into that. So Pat O'Neill's avant-garde and non-linear form of experimental filmmaking conceptually lent itself to designing an interactive spatial narrative that explores this historic site by converting the spaces shot in the film and the ghostly characters that inhabit it into an interface design that allows viewers to navigate through its spaces, interspersed with archival material about the hotel. So I'm not going to have time to go through any of these projects, but what you can do is go to my website at kristykang.com, and in there are excerpts from these two projects I mentioned, among other Labyrinth projects as well. So from developing spatial narratives at Labyrinth, I began to ask what kinds of urban interfaces could be designed to reveal stories that enrich our understanding of our everyday spaces. Before moving to Singapore and NTU, I served as Associate Director of the Spatial Analysis Lab at USC's Price School of Public Planning and Policy, directed by Associate Professor Annette Kim. This interdisciplinary work bridged my work as a designer within the social sciences, situating new media and interactive narrative in public policy and urban studies. The goal of this collaboration between urban planning and new media was to experiment with ways of seeing space and place with newly imagined perspectives, experimenting to see overlooked spaces and overlooked peoples. I continue to collaborate with SLAB and have co-authored an article with Dr. Kim for the Journal of American Planning Association on ethnic placemaking in Los Angeles. Over the last 5 years, through trial and error, LA has had to evolve transparent processes for officially recognizing cultural heritages through symbolic space designations in the city. Most of these are, like signs that you'll see in the city, like Koreatown, historic Filipino town, etc., among others. So this article analyzes Los Angeles' experience to draw generalizable lessons about increasing the diversity of symbolic spaces, which will increasingly be a planning issue in contemporary multicultural cities. This paper grew from one of my research projects, a work of digital placemaking on Koreatown in Los Angeles. The Soul of Los Angeles, Contested Identities and Transnationalism in Immigrant Space, is an online cultural history on the multi-ethnic identity and development of Los Angeles's Koreatown. So what's important to note here is that this is my first project that looks at an ethnic community through digital placemaking, inviting viewers to re-see place using digital media. And this project you can view, it's an online project, and you go to soulofla.com to look at it in more detail. So now I'm going to switch to talking a little bit more about digital placemaking itself. Martin Tomich describes digital placemaking as, quote, the process of using digital media for shaping urban experiences that are citizen-centric, both in their conception and implementation, end quote. Here, digital placemaking is understood as a way for citizens to interact with the city through digital technology that occupies physical space in a city. Digital technology becomes the medium by which people interact with a physical space or physical place. So, you know, you'll hear about digital placemaking often in the context of placemaking initiatives, but also in terms of smart city initiatives and so on. Right? Okay. So, however, digital placemaking takes place not only in physical spaces, but in the public spaces of our interconnected screens on mobile media and the internet, and so on. We can experience this form of digital place from our homes, remotely, and not only while on the street. This extends the conditions of digital placemaking from physical space to its representation in digital space. So in general, we tend to privilege being there, being at this place, the real, right, encounter with the city over mediated experiences of the city, right? But what I'm proposing is that the experience of digital placemaking as representation gives you a potentially more complex way of understanding a place than if you were, you know, there on the street, right? Digital placemaking here is like a virtual urban excavation, excavating what is unseen in the physical environment by using a digital representation of that environment as an interface to reveal its layered lives, right? The layered lives of a place. So as cities change, its layers of cultural history embedded in them are often erased, right? The histories as we walk around, we don't, unless you really know the city or have lived there a long time, they're not often visible to the naked eye. So how can cities tell their invisible stories using digital media? And how does this affect the way we understand a place? So I'm going to introduce now City Stories, a brief introduction, and I'll watch this video. And what this video shows is the situatedness of this project, in the sense that it's set in Singapore. I mean, it's about Singapore. It's about two of the oldest streets in Singapore that used to be the shoreline of the island. And the project itself is exhibited, you know, anyone could go online, you know, on their web browser and watch it, but you can also view it in Singapore in a public gallery in the Urban Redevelopment Authority. So this, what I wanted you to see in this video is what kind of Singapore's everyday landscape looks like, you know, a brief excerpt.
City Stories, Mapping the Spatial Narratives, Singapore's Landscapes, is a community storytelling platform on the multicultural identity and evolution of Telok, Ayer, and Amoy. Those streets were the earliest to be developed in the 1820s and are part of what is known today as Chinatown, the largest conserved historic district in Singapore. Learn how this enclave has historically been home to multiple ethnic communities whose everyday activities create a more complex understanding of place and identity in the city. Discover the changing streetscapes and select shophouses to uncover their stories. Explore the transformation of this area from shoreline to skyline through historic maps. Watch videos and other related materials to uncover the rich diversity of one of the city's oldest neighborhoods.
Okay, so back to the PowerPoint here. So this project shows how this enclave, while it's known as Chinatown today, has historically been home to multiple ethnic communities, which include Indian, Southern Indian, Tamil communities for generations, hundreds of years, as well as several different dialect-speaking Southern Chinese peoples and those from the Malay archipelago, among others. So City Stories explore how these communities' everyday activities create a public history and placemaking in the city that's more diverse than it may initially appear were you on the street itself. It presents a form of digital placemaking that extends the understanding of place from physical space to its representation in digital space. Digital media is used here to develop an interactive interface of Singapore's streets in which narratives of place are made visible in an urban landscape that's continually shifting and developing. This mediated experience of the city invites the viewer to understand a place in more layered or nuanced ways. What does looking at a city through its digital representation do? It helps us see that which we might easily overlook were we on the street itself. It allows for an encounter with the past lives of the city that are made invisible due to urban development, change, and gentrification. And ultimately, it allows us to dig beyond the concrete surface of the city and see a place as more complex than what appears on the street to the naked eye. So if you were to walk down these two streets in Singapore today, you'd see these kind of charming looking preserved heritage sites, which are the shophouses themselves that date, well, you know, it's gone through renovation, but they date really to the pre-colonial period. We're talking 1800s or so, and 19th century. But what is inside the shophouses themselves when you enter are, you know, Korean restaurants, contemporary bars, you know, cafes, and so on. It used to be a neighborhood before renovation that housed families as well as their businesses. So once the Urban Redevelopment Authority chose Singapore as its first site to make it a district for redevelopment of and preservation of cultural heritage and architectural heritage, those residences couldn't be, those shophouses couldn't be residences anymore, right? So they were converted into businesses. That hasn't happened in all of the different ethnic neighborhoods of Singapore, but for this one it did. So ironically, Little India, which is more recently redeveloped, that one does have a bit more kind of residential life, and people can continue to live there while also going to shops and restaurants and so yeah, the Urban Redevelopment Authority kind of slowly changed their tactics in a way, right, in response to some of the criticism that was received about the way that it had developed Chinatown. Okay, so all right. So before I launch the project, I'll give you just a little bit of background on how it came to be. In 2016, the Conservation and Heritage Management Department of the URA invited me to give a presentation on the digital placemaking project on Koreatown that I mentioned. We discussed collaborating on a research project on Singapore. So I proposed looking at two of these oldest streets, Telok, Ayer, and Amoy streets. And I was particularly interested in and astounded actually at the unrecognizability of the geographic landscape of Singapore, where it was hard for you to imagine that this used to be the shoreline where people would migrate to the island, look for jobs, look for work, and the first thing they would do is land there and look for something familiar. So that meant, those who were coming from Fujian province in China would go to the Chinese temple, right? These were coolies and low-wage laborers, right, who were coming into the town at that time to look for work. Then you had the Tamil Muslim community coming to then go look for the mosque, right, and so on. And so those structures are still there as heritage sites, but it's often hard to see them or recognize them, right? And then when you look around, you just have this neighborhood that has a financial district, and any of you who've even seen, images of Singapore represented in television shows like Westworld, right? They set future, metropolis in a place like Singapore. And so that's the conception that most people have about the city: ultra modern, hyper modern, forward thinking, futuristic, and all this. But though that may be true, there is also a very rich and diverse historical aspect that's not always apparent. You kind of have to dig a little bit to discover those things in the city. So, okay. So a research agreement was formed between NTU and URA to develop city stories between 2018 and 2021. Designed to be accessible to the general public and to scholars and planners, the project was developed under my direction with a team of web design and development professionals, researchers, and students from NTU, and with the support of collaborators and key staff from the URA. And part of this was also looking through their archival material, much of which hasn't been digitized. So we just selected a few of the images relevant to these two streets and scanned and digitized those. So these are the images that I'm showing you now on these slides from the URA archives. So primary research included conducting original audio and video interviews with scholars, historians, and current and former residents, which here is an example of some of the family photos from Rick Chu's family, and Rick Chu is a third generation owner of Hoki Bachang rice dumpling, which his grandfather started in the 1940s at 104 Amoy Street. And that business is now relocated to a hawker center that's nearby, and still quite popular, right? But they used to live in one of these shophouses. They lived upstairs and ran their business making these dumplings in the kitchen in the back area of the shophouse. Okay, so other items that we came across, for example, are like the first edition of the Regional Commercial Guide to Singapore. This is basically like a telephone book, or like the yellow pages from 1966. Singapore became independent from the British colonial government in 1965. So a lot of the move towards becoming a newly independent city-state had to do with was integrated with the kind of aspirations towards a new development of the city, right, and a new identity for the city. So what we did with these yellow pages was to find out, okay, was to essentially map them onto the shophouses that we were capturing in the project, right? So that you can go back and look and see, okay, what business was at this particular shophouse in 1966. So the project's aim was to create an interactive platform that allowed visitors to explore what these streets and shophouses looked like before the area went through the process of development and conservation, while learning about the area's rich and diverse cultural history. So just, so Singapore, in terms of its conservation and development of, in terms of developing a department that handled conservation or urban conservation, didn't start until 1989. So that's, you know, quite late, but or relatively recent. Prior to that, there were what they would do was create historic landmarks that were buildings, right? But after that, from 1989 on, they started to designate historic districts, right? Chinatown being one, Kampong Glam, which is representative of the Malay communities there and histories there, and Little India. So those are the three main, what they call ethnic enclave neighborhoods that are in Singapore. Okay. So some of these archival images were they started to be taken around 1960 or shortly after 1965. So the earliest ones that I think we saw were somewhere around 1969, and they were just survey photos that the urban planning department just sent people out to take photos of all over the city of the various buildings and so on. Okay, so launched to the public in the summer of 2020, City Stories can be viewed online. So you just go to citystories.sg and you can view it on your desktop or laptop. It's not designed to be a mobile experience. You kind of need a larger screen for this. So you're welcome to view it on your own. But what I'll do now is I will open the project and just give you a little bit of a tour of how it works. Okay, so when you launch the project, you could essentially scroll through, I lost my mouse here, okay. Scroll through the streets. And this kind of mimics the idea of you're strolling and walking along these streets, an interactive panorama. As you do this, you can at any time switch between 1984 and 2019. So these are kind of more contemporary, it's a contemporary streetscape of Telok, Ayer, and Amoy streets. And then if you click here at the bottom of the screen, you can then see what it looked like in 1984. These were taken from the archival images that I told you about and stitched together to make the panorama. And layer image, one of the things that you can do is layer the 1984 and the 2019 image as you go through. And so if you were to go into any one of the shophouses, so there are I think about 175 actual, locations or addresses. And we selected 60 of them in order to put in content. So if you were to go into any of these through the location marker at the top, you would then go inside and you'll see what the shop house looks like. In 2009, it more or less looks the same as it does now, and what it did look like in 1984. And these are other images from different periods of time, 1981. And here's an example of what business used to be there in 1966. Okay. And so many of these have this kind of information on it. The idea, though, is that we wanted to include this as a platform that would allow more materials or stories to be added. So, for example, another way that you can navigate through city stories is to use the index. And here, all 60 locations you can either view numerically or by topic. So conservation projects, diversity in Chinatown, landmarks, and so on. And if I were to go into life stories, I'll show you one here. Or well, actually, I'll show you the one of Rick Chu, the Hoki Bachang owner. And so that takes you directly to the address in question. And here's a little video of him explaining his family business.
My name is Rick Chu. I'm the third generation of Hoki Bachang, which is originated in Amoy. I'm actually running the business with my dad and my mom. It started by my grandfather, who came from Fujian in China. So he probably has the knowledge of how to do the Hoki Bachang. And that explains why we do only the Hoki Bachang. So 1948, he actually started making his own bachang to sell. Previously, he wasn't in this bachang business, so he was actually doing a clerk in a government agency. When his family member grows bigger, so he finds that he needs to bring in more doughs to support his family. So he turned to the food industry because he sees that maybe doing bachang will actually help to subsidize the income and feed the family. So Hoki bachang is actually texture is actually dark color or made glutinous rice. So the rice is actually being fried prior to being red. And the ingredients are basically the chestnut, roasted chestnut, marinated pork, and for now we have like additions like the mushroom and salted egg yolk. The whole bachang presentation is a bit brownish. So it's different from the Cantonese type, for example, which is like white, or the Nonyat, as in they use uses the bamboo leaves.
Okay, so, and there are other videos in here that one can explore that have different excerpts from interviews where he recalls his childhood memories on Amoy streets and so on. So, okay. So besides including the life stories of former residents, one of the things that interested us about this project was trying to reveal and excavate the diversity of the ethnic communities that had long lived in this area. And so this is Al-Abrar Mosque, which is still active, functioning Muslim mosque on this street. And I'll show an excerpt here of a video explaining a little bit more about this area.
If you look at Telok Street specifically, it actually has two places of worship belonging to the Muslim community. One of them is actually a commemorative shrine where Sufi scholar, the Harka is a commemorative shrine. The other is specifically a mosque, Al-Akbar Mosque. So these two Chuya or Tamil Muslim religious institutions really tell us, in one terms, how much Telok Ayer Bay and really something that bay was a shared space. Not only that, something else less visible today is the fact that there was also a Malay town further down from Telok Ayer Street. So if you go from one end of Telok Ayer to the other end, and its southern end, all that would indicate Malay town. And today, even though there are no traces of the community, you get two relics of this presence. One of them would be the Hilltop Mausoleum of Khalid Noh. Of course, Khalid Noh himself is our partner in his continent, so he has a Tamil ancestry. And then you also have the mosque at the base of the hill, Haji Muhammad Salim Mosque, built by a Malay from the area. They were called the town in this area, Jakarta Malay. So these are the two institutions which you can add to the Hokkien Temple, Al-Akbar Mosque, and Barbara Dhaka. So that's the whole gamut of ethnic diversity across the region.
Okay, so if we go back to Street View, and another section and way that you can explore the project is not just through the street and, you know, the various topics, interviews, and other archival materials you can explore about each of these shop houses and locations, but there is also an explore map view. And here you see a kind of snapshot of what we're talking about here in terms of, this is Google Maps. And so this is Telok, Ayer, and Amoy streets just occupy this particular part. If this is like the Marina Bay area, which is newly recently reclaimed site that's part of the financial district, the new financial district. And there's still more land reclamation that's happening now, right? And this financial center is expanding. So here, what you can do, like in Street View, you can go and look at historic maps, okay? So these were, this is a map from 1846. And when I say that this used to be the shoreline, well, here's Telok Ayer, right, street itself. And if you use the same layer image function that you have in Street View, you can see what, you know, where the shoreline actually used to be in 1846, okay? So each of these maps show you different aspects and highlight different locations that are no longer on the map, right? If you were to go there today. And this includes the map that Imran bin Tajuddin was talking about in the where you can actually look if you were to this area, if you were to zoom in on this, which I can't do right now because anyway, but this is the Malay town that he's spoke about. That the only two vestiges of the fact that there used to be a Malay town in that area were the shrines that he mentioned in the video. And those still stand today, but there's a freeway, right, that goes through it. So this freeway here. And so if you were to drive along this freeway, you'd see this mosque, this shrine, and that's where it is. Okay, a lot of people, I always wondered what it was. And through this project, I discovered, you know, what the shrine was that I kept driving by all the time. Okay, so lastly, I'm gonna end just showing you the gallery section. So this section of the project includes an array of additional materials that are not location specific, meaning they're not particular to a shop house address, right? And so, for example, you can look at early paintings, right, of this area that again shows you the shoreline and Telok Ayer Street here. This hilltop has been raised. It's no longer there because it was used for the first reclamation that happened. So and so on. And what I'm going to do is I will end with a video, since we didn't talk about the Indian migration and community that comprised Singapore's history. I'll end with this.
What we know at least in the 19th century is that these Indian communities had if not a monopoly, but a dominant position on the kind of trade that was going on in the Singapore. Many of these company ships, many of these European, what were called as European ships, were in fact a cosmopolitan mix of Indian and European personnel. And so they had a significant presence, not just on the seafront, but also on the riverfront. The Indian presence tended to be concentrated around where European authorities were. So, one would have seen this extending more or less from Padang to around the Fort Canning area on the eastern side of the Singapore River. You had some people beginning also to establish themselves on this side of the Singapore River, the western side of the Singapore River, because of course this was an important commercial area very soon after the founding of the settlement. So you had this Indian stagger on both sides of it. Once the Raffles town plan is affected, it is affected around 1822-23. And it marked up an area nearby for Europeans on the eastern side. Then on the west or southwest side of the river, you had an important trading area, and then followed by Chinatown. Even though this didn't feature properly in Lieutenant Jackson's map, you find, in fact, that many of the Tamil Muslim communities from the Rhino coast, the Chulias, moved in that area and had a significant presence within the Chinatown area around Telok, Ayer, and so on. Now, in this area, you already had commercial operations of Indian groups. By the late 1820s and perhaps a little later as well, some Chettiars had also moved into the area. But the largest numbers were the Tamil Muslim groups that established a place around Telok, Ayer, and areas that came to be known as the Chulia area in Chinatown. We find the Parsi traders also setting up, establishing themselves, especially this would have been just by the river. Many of their trading houses would have been there, and they were, of course, engaged also in the trade in the early part of the 19th century. Some of them would have been living in that area as well. So, right along Telok High Street, and indeed, there were many people who lived on the river. So, the river itself was a place of residence. The boats were homes for them as well. So I think you see all these different groups occupying different economic positions, living in that area, in that space.
Okay, so I think we're at time, and I want to be able to take questions from people. So I'm going to end here. And, just invite you to visit the site on your own. There's quite a lot of material in it. I certainly learned a lot about the history of Singapore and its ethnic populations and so on, working on this project, and trying to visualize it was kind of my process for how to learn about its history. So I welcome you to do this on your own, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yes, hi.
I think the earliest I heard how far back have you seen practice being used past areas and towns, like you said, Chinatown, how far back have you seen this?
So do you mean like in terms of how far do the maps go in the archives, or
Is it basically just all maps we can see? Like, as long as there's any sort of image or map, we can just trace it back through digital placemaking?
yeah, okay, so for this particular project, we had to make choices, right, in terms of which maps, which images we were going to use, because we couldn't do all of them. And there are actually other digital humanities projects that are being conducted in Singapore that use GIS technology, as well as the actually the National Archives of Singapore and the Public Library have taken a lot of steps towards making their work, you know, their archives digitally accessible to the public. And so they have a tool that you can go and select certain maps, historic maps, and then overlay them, right? But all it does is the maps. It doesn't do these other cultural histories and stuff. So there's several scholars and as well as public institutions who are doing this sort of work in Singapore, and in a way going through their own process of how do you see the city and how do you see its history through these kind of digital processes.
Thank you so much, Kristy. It was wonderful to hear about your work, but also I feel like I did learn a lot about American arts, history, cultural heritage, and so forth. So you can see the heuristic value of this just straight away. And I have a question about this idea of visualizing and mapping the city as a way to represent it. And how you're talking about how, you know, we usually privilege to sort of create their physical space, but the digital humanities and these kind of visualization techniques help us to experience it in a different way, learn about it, but also that it's interacting in some way with the physical itself. I'm wondering, I didn't really talk about this yet, but I'm wondering if there is work being done on the sort of talking back of the interactive media and how that affects the space of the city now, how it changes perhaps our phenomenological experience of the city, if there are theories or there are other kinds of work being done around the question of that interaction between the digital and physical.
Yeah, so there's actually, there's quite a lot of work that's been done. A lot of it is actually kind of more new and emerging. So I was actually part of a panel just last week, like last Thursday, yeah, a week ago, a virtual panel that was held in New York City, but organized by built heritage planners, right? Urban planners and built heritage scholars and planners. And so I was part of a panel on how do you, I don't know, reclaim heritage through digital tools, right? So a lot of this is the kind of it's a complex kind of topic, and one that people are grappling with in different ways. And also, I think one of the topics that came up that we only just began to talk about, which I think is quite salient, is that yes, though this digital way of looking through and excavating a city might be available, right? It still, as an object itself, exists in its own space, in digital space, which does not follow the same rules as physical location, right? So I can go, I can, be a tourist in Singapore, and I'll probably go to these two streets and certainly go to Chinatown. But will I know where to find city stories? That's another question, right? And that's also a really big challenge in the digital humanities as well, right? In terms of finding these projects. Also their longevity, because even though brick and mortar is also fragile and ephemeral, digital media is in some ways even more ephemeral, right? So there's always that kind of aspect of it too. Yeah. I don't know if that really answers your question, but these are at least some of the concerns and issues that I think are facing, these digital objects as we build them to be in conversation with the built environment.
Hi, thank you. It's just a thought exercise, but based on your expertise and your research project, have you seen moments where this is being used by government or business communities to lay claim to parts of the city in order to develop? In other words, okay, you have your history and memories through these digital archives. Now we can just go ahead and lay claim to these areas and build the city, or however they envision. So in some sense, involving gentrification, but not necessarily. And then on the other side, when does, or how do we still have a right to the city and to make changes to the city? For example, at the pace that we're making things historic, pretty soon the codes and regulations and everything won't be able to change any parts, especially core parts of older parts of cities. So just was wondering thoughts, or if this is a conversation going on in your circles. Thank you.
Yeah, it's this is something that is in a way part of the debate, right? And the kind of tension that exists in these projects, in the sense that, okay, so here I am, I have a project that's being funded by the Urban Redevelopment Authority, whose primary goal is to be responsible for what gets built in the city and what gets demolished in the city, right? But I'm working with actually a really wonderful, particularly wonderful, not that bureaucratic group of people in the Conservation and Heritage Management Department who understand the dynamics of what happens in Singapore. It's a tiny island. You can't really preserve everything. It's impossible while being able to house 5.5 million people, right? So what to do? So then what does heritage end up meaning in that sense, right? Part of it is being able to disseminate and share the stories across generations through various public engagement projects, which they do every year. They have heritage festivals and so on. Others are through projects like this and others, and so on. So they're very aware of that tension, right? And try to come up with different ways to address it, right? Given the way that Singapore works. Other places like, let's say, Los Angeles, right? So this article that I wrote with Annette, where we're looking at how do people in LA mobilize to get an ethnic place name, slapped onto the city. And this was actually really a grassroots development. It's kind of a top down, depending on the city you're talking about. It's usually something top down. In this case, we found that it was communities, ethnic communities in particular neighborhoods that felt that they wanted to make a mark in the city, right? To be recognized as having been there, right? So for example, in Koreatown, there is a little Bangladesh community that's been there since the 1980s. And people might, notice it because there's a Bangladeshi grocery store, here, or a mosque. But it was important for that community to be acknowledged through one of the official LA city plaques, slapped on the sign between, this and this street is Little Bangladesh. And so they weren't so concerned with the designation in terms of how much of Little Bangladesh it was called. They just wanted the sign, right? And so it was fascinating to talk about and meet these various groups. Many of them were just business owners and others were just community organizers and so on, who felt that it was important, at least the naming, right? Regardless of whether or not those neighborhoods remain Little Bangladesh or Koreatown or whatever, right? That the naming still had some kind of meaning for people. So, but that's a kind of informal process that's now become more formalized through different rules. It was ad hoc before, and it's no longer so ad hoc. Oh, and sorry, one more, I'll just do a plug that there is Stacey, to answer your question about, there is a recent publication called the Routledge Companion to Media in the City that should have a lot of other articles, right? But I haven't received my copy yet, so I don't know, I haven't read any of these essays, but there are several essays in there. It just came out in July, so I'm excited to read about it and like answer some of the questions that you were posing. Hopefully they'll be addressing those in this book. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah, thank you.